If we want to be fully human, we must be fully free, and that means fully rational, and that means fully good. Accept no substitutes, is what Marcus Aurelius says. He did that himself, and he hopes that other people will do it. He did the best he could, and you can't help but feel that at the end of his life, he must have felt relieved that the terrible crushing burden of this loneliness, a man that has no equals and has no friends, a man that has nothing but philosophy to guide him, death must have been a great release. It's like getting the evening off after you've put in your turn guarding the camp. And instead of becoming an obscure and unimportant figure, he's become a symbol in the history of Western philosophy of the practical, concrete, immediate virtues, the sort of virtues which are accessible to us, not because we have profound intellectual ability, not because we're a Newton or a Kant, but simply because we have problems and we're everyday rational human beings. The Stoic man says that a virtue that is possible for one man is accessible to all of us. There is no excuse for us not being that good. If we provide such excuses for ourselves, we harm ourselves and we harm others by preventing us from recognizing our true moral obligations. Marcus Aurelius lets us know that all people suffer, but that not all people pity themselves. Marcus Aurelius lets us know that all men die, but that not all men die whining.
Hi, and welcome to The Seeker
and The Skeptic.
I'm Kat, and I'm the flaky, unpredictable, maybe a bit irrational Seeker.
And I'm Rebecca. I'll be your sarcastic, grumpy, close-minded, skeptical host. Or maybe we should just be ourselves.
Sounds good to me. This podcast is going to dive deep into the controversial topics that some may call New Age, or woo-woo, or just plain foolish.
And hopefully look at them with a skeptical but open-minded approach that will encourage understanding and acceptance from both the skeptics
and the seekers. This episode, we're talking about Stoicism, the ancient philosophy that is currently experiencing a revival.
Hooray! I can't wait!
That's not very Stoic of you.
Yeah, like skepticism, Stoicism kind of has a bit of a bad rap, but you can actually be an enthusiastic Stoic.
Well, you should know, Rebecca is just back from Stoicon Athens, a huge conference all about Stoic philosophy. Are you still wearing your toga?
Of course, it's just so comfortable.
So what's this Stoicism all about?
Okay, so, I mean, it's a big topic, so we're just going to give the basics in this show, but there was this dude called Zeno, like 300 BC, and he rocks up in Athens and starts studying philosophy, like goes talking to all the, because back in the day, there were just ancient philosophers wandering around on the streets. I mean, this is my interpretation. And he went and talked to them.
My idea of heaven.
And started getting ideas, and he started his own group, which he actually called Zenotians. They were later renamed Stoics because they didn't like that name. But I actually think that's pretty cool, Zenotians. The school continued, and other famous Stoics got involved. And these are very separated by time. Though we have Seneca, everyone's probably heard of him, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, all Stoic philosophers, separated by like hundreds of years, but picking up the same ideas that Zeno started off in 300 BC. It's Zeno, not Zenu, not like the Scientology guy, just to be clear. But yeah, so the basics of it...
That's another episode.
Yeah, definitely. The basics of it are kind of summed up by the Serenity Prayer from AA. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Which is kind of trite now because we've all heard it so many times, but it's actually a really useful guide for living your life. The Stoic idea is basically...
It's my favourite prayer.
Yeah. The Stoic idea is basically that the way to eudaimonia, which is basically their word for like happiness, or it's usually translated as happiness, but it might be closer to flourishing or just the good life. So the way to get
translates
all those things.
to good spirit.
Ah, good spirit. That's nice. So the way to get there...
Yeah, when you think about it, like good-spiritedness.
So the way to get there is through recognizing what you can and can't affect in the world and adopting an attitude of acceptance to the first whilst, acting virtuously on the latter, which that's the Serenity Prayer, and that makes perfect sense to me. But the difference from this and like what we think of as modern philosophy, which is like, boring old people talking in ivory towers. It's very practical. It's not just abstract theorizing about, the details of metaphysics or whatever. They have lots of practical advice on how to live. And I think that's why the modern Stoicism revival is taking off now, because they're developing practices that make that attitude stick. And Stoicon, which is the conference I went to, is a gathering of modern Stoics, or not necessarily Stoics, but people who are interested in it, people who are studying it, people who think it's useful or worthwhile. And yeah, we're going to get into talking about it, but it's just weird to be talking on the Seeker and the Skeptic about something that I'm interested in. I feel like the tables have turned because I like Stoicism. I'm passionate about Stoicism, and you're going to grill me about it. So what did you think when I said I was going to a Stoicism conference?
Well, I guess as a seeker, I first came across Stoicism from listening to Tim Ferriss and hearing some pithy quotes that he'd read out from Seneca. And I learned some tools like negative visualization for overcoming anxiety, and as well as like how certain passages have helped him face day-to-day life without being overwhelmed with the critics and the other assholes that he might encounter. So like one quote that really gets me is, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," from Seneca. And what I love is, it's not giving us any direct how-to steps. Like a lot of this stuff is kind of like, oh, isn't that true? It's not, the stuff that I'd come across was quite, it's self-helpy, but without the kind of instructional element. When I found out that you were going, I was like, it makes sense. I know that we've spoken about a lot of things that would suggest that you are a pretty good example of somebody who's pretty stoic or has like taken on a lot of the principles of what I understood Stoicism to mean. But we hadn't really discussed it a lot. I just knew that we were both like more or less approving of Stoicism.
Yeah, one of the rare topics that we both like enthusiastic about. I think as a skeptic, it's the perfect fit, and I'm kind of surprised that more skeptics aren't into Stoicism, because as I go on about ad nauseum to anyone who will listen, for me, skepticism is about reason, logic, understanding the world, looking for evidence, all that stuff, and compassion, because we care about people. That's why we bother, that's why I bother saying, oh, I'm a bit worried about homeopathy, because I care about people. I don't want people to be hurt. So reason and compassion are the two core values of skepticism as far as I see it. And Stoicism's four virtues are reason, which they were sometimes called wisdom, compassion, which they sometimes called justice, and then two more, courage, the courage to act on your reason and compassion, and temperance, like being able to bite your tongue sometimes. Yeah, exactly. And so if skeptics develop those two extra virtues of courage and temperance, I think the skeptics movement would do a lot better, because often I'm too intimidated to bring up an issue that I think is important. And I know lots of other skeptics, and myself too, get pissed off and say things we regret when we see something that we think is stupid. So yeah. But then again, like you say, it's kind of, it feels a bit self-helpy, and I'm always leery of anything that sounds like self-help, because I know it's like the whole industry of self-help is a bit of a mess with people making like wildly unevidenced claims. I wonder whether that's partly also just a bit of pride, like I don't need self-help sort of attitude. So yeah, I have mixed feelings, but generally pretty enthusiastic about this conference.
So what were your expectations of the conference before you went?
Well, I went to Stoicon last year as well when it was in London. So I sort of had a vague idea what to expect. Generally, there's this interesting divide that... First of all, I went with some other people. So I went with my husband, Paul, who's also interested in Stoicism. I don't think he'd call himself a Stoic, but he's definitely, interested in those ideas and has read a bit around it. And I went with our friend Adrian, who's more interested in Buddhism. But there's a lot of overlap between Buddhism and Stoicism, which we'll talk about later. So I was pretty sure he was going to be on board. And then we also took our friend Tom, who's sort of along for the ride, just wanted to see Athens. And so he hadn't read anything about Stoicism, didn't know much more than what I told him. So it was going to be interesting. And I think because I kind of knew what to expect, and I knew I was going to enjoy myself, but I was thinking, oh, are they going to like it? Is it going to, I've dragged all these people to Athens to see this thing, and I'm not sure if they're going to enjoy it. So that's like the concern about other people's experience overriding my own, which is a great thing to work through as a Stoic, to be like, well, I can't control their emotions and their reactions to this conference. I should just focus on what I can control, which is what I tried to do. But so we turn up at this place, the American School of Classical Studies, which is where the conference was being held. And just for context, Athens, I mean, I'm sure there are lovely areas of Athens, but as I told Kat, she was like, how was Athens? I was like, well, it's one of those European cities where it's culturally accepted to piss on the streets. And that was kind of the vibe I was getting off Athens. It was a bit dirty. I saw more people urinating than I really wanted to. And it could have just been the area we're staying, because I'm a wizard for finding cheap Airbnbs. But generally, I wasn't enjoying the city that much. And we step through into the gardens of the American School of Classical Studies, and it's all marble, like just beautiful marble everywhere. Wow. And all these fragrant plants, like herbs and stuff, just like there's thyme, there's oregano, there's a big geranium bush, like everything smells wonderful. And I don't know whether this is a reaction to the fact that the rest of the city doesn't smell so good, or it could just be the Mediterranean climate is good for growing things. But yeah, it felt like I had that feeling, like that sort of, oh, this is a silly feeling, but this is how I felt. I was like, oh, this must have been what it was like. People wafting around in togas, and the white marble and the big buildings and the beautiful olive trees and all these lovely smelling plants, and people walking around, having a glass of wine, talking about philosophy. It was magic. It was like walking into my dream conference. So that was pretty amazing. And
nice.
The people there, well, like I was just about to say, at the previous conference, we kind of had expectations of what the people would be like, because they fall into two broad categories as far as I see it. They are chalky old uncles who are like academics. They might be wearing tweed. They possibly have pipes, and they're generally, they're into Stoicism from the side of being classic scholars, and they're cool, but they're chalky. And by chalky, I mean, like they work on blackboards and they have chalk on there. They're literally chalky. And then the other half are all hipsters, like tech bros. They have tattoos. They have that neatly cut hair, short back and sides with a bit long on top, all the same haircut. They might be drinking Soylent instead of eating food. They're that sort of guy. Generally quite handsome and buff, which is nice. That's a good opportunity. The gender split is interesting as well, because there's dramatically more men than women at this place. So if any of our female listeners are looking for a emotionally well-regulated man, I would recommend Stoic conferences.
Why didn't I?
Yeah, next year.
Why didn't I come on? Yeah.
We actually guessed after we'd been on the first day, because it's kind of 2 days. There was Stoicon and then Stoicon X at the same place the next day, so it felt like a 2-day conference. So at the end of the first day, I took a poll from my friends of what we thought the gender divide was. And Tom and Paul guessed like 10% female, really low. And me and Adrian guessed about 30%. And then we went and spoke to the organisers, and they said it's usually 25 to 30% women at Stoic conferences, and indeed all philosophy events. That's usually how it breaks down.
Wow.
I did.
Yeah, I mean, why am I? I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Yeah. People talk about it being a problem in philosophy. I'm not sure if it's a problem, because it's like philosophy is about searching for...
It is what it is.
Yeah. Philosophy is about searching for truth. So it's not like women aren't searching for truth. They're just maybe not doing it at in these venues. I studied literature at university, and it was almost all women there. So I think it's just, it's, like you say, it's one of those things. Just
beginning from the first day, was it like back-to-back talks?
It pretty much was back-to-back talks, brief breaks for... lunch, and there was a slight air of panic in the air, because you know how conferences go when someone's running a little bit late, and then everything gets backed up, and then which is kind of ironic for us.
But people don't want to come across as like not Stoic, so I guess everyone's like, no, but we're fine with it.
Yes, exactly. What will be, will be.
And who are the leaders? Like, were there celebrity Stoics there?
Well, Massimo Paolucci was there, who to me is a celebrity Stoic. I don't know, because he's a skeptic, or I don't know, he comes from the skeptic world. I listened to him on the Skeptic podcast, and he's involved in skepticism. So to me, he's kind of a big deal. Yeah, there was a couple of other people who I recognize the names of, but I think a big thing about Stoicism is they don't really do celebrity. The woman who was like the organizer, she was amazing. She was a really good like compere for the whole event. She did a sort of introductory speech, and she said, and this really moved me, this is amazing to see you all here because after 2,500 years, Stoic philosophy has returned to its birthplace. And I was just, you know, that old song, the old football song, it's coming home, it's coming, football's
God.
I had that playing in my head, replaced with Stoicism.
Nice.
Because
That's
the
really
Stoa
cheesy.
Paliki, yeah, I know, but I can't help what goes on in my head. Or maybe I can. The Stoa Paliki, which is where Zeno first started preaching, talking about Stoicism, which is actually why it's called Stoicism. It's from the word stoa, which means porch, the painted porch. Anyway, it's only 15 minutes walk from this venue. So she said the Stoa Paliki is only 15 minutes walk, but we prefer it here because it's air conditioned, which I thought was great.
That's awesome. It's really something to be in a place that, you know, even if it's changed a lot since those days, that is the original place. Yeah. That's like an amazing thing.
It was very different to going to Stoicon in a university in London, which was great. It was a great venue, but it didn't have that feeling of like historicism.
Yeah.
The
talks.
Yeah, the first one that really struck me, or it might have actually been the first one. I'm going to talk about just a handful of them because there were lots, but they were all very interesting. The first one that I'm going to talk about is by a guy called Jonas Salzberger, and the title of the talk was "The Stoics in Exile." And he was just a really like, I don't know, just, you know, when you get a good vibe off someone, just as soon as he walks onto the stage, he's relaxed, he's confident, he's like doesn't take himself too seriously. I was like, oh, I like this dude immediately. And he starts off by saying, you know, lots of Stoics were exiled for preaching. I keep saying preaching. That's an interesting Freudian slip, for talking about Stoicism and for teaching Stoicism, because, you know, the rulers of the day didn't like what they were saying. So he said, if you're going to be exiled onto some strange little island, you have to get good at making the best of situations. And the example he gave was that classic thing of like, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first. And most of the people at the conference have just got off a plane, so this feels quite, you know, immediate to us. He's basically talking about how you have to take responsibility for your own actions and reactions, and then everything else comes on after that. So if you're exiled to some island, you make, this is quoting Epictetus, make the best of what's in your power and take the rest as it happens. And I mean, Epictetus should have known, because he was like, he didn't have the most, you know, privileged life. He was born a slave and he was crippled. I couldn't figure out whether that was due to his, you know, his masters abusing him, or whether he was actually born with some kind of problem, physical problem. But anyway, so yeah, he eventually was freed and ended up teaching philosophy, but he pissed off the wrong people and was exiled. So, you know, the Stoics lived these really kind of crazy lives where really bad things happen to them. And that idea of like, make the best of what's in your power and take the rest as it happens, it sounds like obvious and kind of trite, but actually it's like really, really good advice if you're in that situation. And then when Jonas was giving this talk, he pressed his clicker and the wrong slide came up, and he just looked over it, smiled and said, "Oh, okay," and continued with his presentation. And I was just like, oh, that's Stoicism in action. Like, I've been, because you know how stressful it is. You know how stressful it is to be up on stage giving a presentation, and then when something goes wrong, I've done it myself. I've seen many people, you know, like they start to stumble, they start to stutter, they say, "Oh no," or something like that. But that like, "Oh, okay," and then carry on. Brilliant. Yeah. The next talk that really, this one was one I was not looking forward to, because it's a guy I never heard of before, Thomas Jarrett, talking about military stoicism, and it's like anything to do with the army or the military, I'm just not interested. It's like, you have to tie me to a chair to make me watch a war movie. I hate it. It's not.
Yes,
I guess, same. It's part of it is ideological. I'd like to come across as like this pacifist person who just can't deal with the idea of war. And I'm definitely not a fan of war, and I probably am a pacifist. But also I just find it incredibly boring. Just
yes. It's like, have you seen Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, and I should love that because I love Heart of Darkness.
I should love it too, and I can't.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why. It just a complete turn off. So I actually thought about not going to this talk, but it was like, the first morning, and I was like, okay, fine, it's only however long it is. I'll just sit and endure it for the podcast. So the guy gets up on the stage, and almost immediately I'm like, oh, actually, I kind of like this dude too. He just had a lovely, he just had a lovely presence. Again, like very confident, very self-assured. And he was talking about this thing called Stoic resilience training, which is basically teaching Stoicism to soldiers in active duty. And that was his job. That's what he did for the army. It was later renamed warrior resilience training. And then I think after that, mastery resilience training. But it's basically taking Stoic principles and a bit of REBT, which we'll talk about later, which is like a cognitive behavioral therapy based on Stoic principles. And teach it to the people who need it most, as far as he can see it, which is these people going into wars. It was funny because on the way over to the first day of the conference, Adrian, who, like I said, didn't really know that much about Stoicism, he knows Buddhism better. He was like, "Oh, I don't know about. I don't think it's really worth any philosophy. Isn't really worth its salt unless it can help you manage when you're in a situation where you have to set yourself on fire." And he's thinking of those Buddhist monks and the self-immolation.
Right.
And I was like, "Ooh, yeah, well, Stoicism might well be up your alley then, because it's for dealing with extreme situations." And then when Thomas Jarrett said, "I don't have any time for any philosophy that doesn't work if I'm going to die the next day," in his talk, I like nudged Adrian, like, "Yeah, it's for you."
Yeah.
Yeah. This guy has an interesting story in himself. So he's an army guy, but he protested the Iraq war. He thought it was needless and hubristic. He just really thought it was a bad idea, was very passionate about protesting it. But when the war started, he was like, well, I can't stop the war, so I'm going to volunteer as a medic and see what I can do to help these people psychologically who have to go. Which, I mean, it sounds almost like hypocritical, but actually it's a very Stoic thing. Like, when you can act, you do the best you can, and when you can't, he can't stop the war. Now it's happening, so now he reassesses the situation and does the best thing he can do as far as he sees in this situation, which is to help these people who, if they didn't have the training that he offers, might be psychologically injured from their experiences. So yeah, I was so surprised at how moved I was by his talk. He was talking about the horrors of war and what it can do to people. He talked a lot about PTSD, and he said that he prefers to think of it as, it was originally called post-traumatic stress injury, not disorder, and he thinks that's a better term because disorder implies that it's lifelong, but as far as he sees it, it's an injury that you can overcome and you can prepare for, and it's just like really, yeah. Afterwards, I talked to a couple of people, actually, and I said, I don't know why, but I got so emotional when Thomas Jarrett was speaking, and I wasn't expecting to. And a couple of other people said, yeah, me too. I think it's just that thing of imagining these people in this really extreme situation.
Right.
And something about, he was talking a lot about honor, and I mean, that's a big thing for Stoics, upholding personal honor and, doing the right thing according to your own values. And yeah, it made me think about war and about the military in a much more sympathetic way than I ever had before, which I think is probably good for me.
But also, that's like a Stoic idea, is this kind of like, because I mean, we'll get to it, but I didn't realize how important, I guess, compassion or caring for others was to Stoicism. And maybe there are better words for that, but that sounds like it's really important. And yeah, that's interesting that that's kind of what that called on.
Yeah, it's weird that Stoicism has a rap as being not about that. Actually, that's kind of the next talk I was going. We had a lunch break, which was fine. They had little brown lunch bags, and maybe they had some vegan ones, but I didn't even bother to look. I just went round the corner to a vegan restaurant and came back. So I didn't really experience the lunch. But when we came back, there was a talk from a guy called John Sellers for the benefit of all on being a social Stoic. And this is exactly what you were saying. He said people think Stoicism is very individualistic and maybe kind of selfish, but it's because it's all focused on how you can be a better person. But he went through some Marcus Aurelius. Interestingly, Marcus Aurelius is often seen as like the most self-focused of the Stoics. But so John Sellers specifically chose him to show that even this guy that people think of as being the most self-focused spoke a lot about, our duty as social creatures. He said something along the lines of, this is Marcus Aurelius, said something along the lines of, we should behave well towards others because we're all part of a bigger whole. And what's injurious to the whole is injurious for the part. In fact, he goes as far as saying, and John was quoting him saying, like an antisocial person is like an abscess on the face of humanity. Yeah, pretty harsh. He basically said, we're all social creatures. Therefore we should act in accordance with our nature, and therefore we should not be antisocial. Which kind of makes sense, but as much as I like and think it's important to be social, I couldn't help but like picking it apart in my skeptical way and thinking, we're social creatures, yeah, maybe, I mean, debatable, but probably we grew up living in tribes, we evolved like this, so I take that premise. We should act in accordance with our nature. I don't know if that follows, and therefore we should not be antisocial.
Weirdly, that is really interesting. That whole idea of like human nature, they seem to think is naturally, and this is like an ancient idea. I know that the ancient Greeks believed that there's a natural like harmony, like harmonia to the world, and that human nature is part of that. And so, we're just naturally good. I don't know. It's not. I want to believe that. I truly do.
Yeah, me too.
But it doesn't seem evident.
I also think it comes across that classic is-all, like David Hume was like, you can describe what the universe is like, but you can't derive ethics from a description of what is. You need values, basically. I think sometimes it's called the values gap. Like you can't derive values from reality. And I felt like they were kind of brushing over that point. Like, we should act in accordance with our nature. Well, why is the question? Why should we act in accordance with our nature? You can't just say that. You can't just state that. You need to back it up. There was another talk, one of the workshops, which was on a similar theme. He was talking about David Fiedler, this guy, or maybe Fiedler, I don't know. He was talking about the environmentalism and how that links to Stoic ethics. And I felt like he had the same blind spot on or maybe they just didn't get an opportunity to get into it because these are brief talks and workshops. I'm sure people have thought about this and thought about this whole is-ought problem with relation to Stoicism. But basically he was talking about how there was, I got the impression, and again, maybe you should go have a look at his book if you're interested in this. It's called well, I don't know what it's called actually, but his talk was called The Stoic Cosmopolis, Why We're Born to Be Ethical. I can't remember the name of the book. But anyway, he's an interesting guy, but he definitely seemed to be talking about some sort of intelligence in nature and how it was important to live in accordance with that and all these sort of things. And I just felt like one did not follow from the other. But this idea that there is like a world soul, I think that might be Plato's term,
right,
is all over the metaphysics of Stoicism. Oh, I've got a couple of quotes. Marcus Aurelius writes, constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are cooperating causes of all things that exist. Observe too the continuous spinning of the thread and the structure of the web. Which is beautiful, but that doesn't sound like philosophy to me. It sounds a bit like poetry. And then Chrysippus said, much simpler, the universe is its own soul and its own controlling mind. So that idea of everything being one and like the divinity of the whole, it's very deep in Stoicism, and it's just something that as an atheist I couldn't really follow along with, especially with what I felt like were gaps in logic. In the next day, there was like a short, I don't know how to describe it, like, those lightning presentations, short talks from people. And one of the guys who got up was saying how Stoics really should focus more on the logic part of their philosophy and like get down to some of the very base principles and analyze them a bit closer. And I was like, yes, please, that would be nice. But yeah. And the other thing that he talked about, John Sellers, this is in the talk about the social Stoics. He said, look, we should behave well to others because, like I said, behaving poorly is injurious to the whole, and that comes back on us, basically. Like if you're a dick, then you make the world slightly worse, and then you have to live in that world that's slightly worse, so don't do it, which is practical advice. But it's also kind of selfish advice if you think about it, because it's about you. It's about your experience in
and
the world.
It's not going to necessarily always lead to you doing the most ethical thing. That same logic is going to backfire at some point and harm someone, basically.
Yeah, I just think if you're going to make a defense and say Stoicism isn't selfish because these principles, then the principles have to be unselfish. And right. When it's a thing that comes up, I don't know, like, as I said, I think Stoicism's great, and maybe I don't fully understand these ideas, but these are just what's coming up in my head as I'm listening to the things. The other kind of slightly defensive talk, but it's one I really enjoyed, by Matt Sharp. It was called The Acropolis, the Inner Citadel, and the View from Above. And side note, I think this is one of these academic things where you have to give the name of your talk like months before you even write it, because so many of the talk names are super boring, and you don't really understand what they're going to be talking about. So again, I'm like, oh, this sounds okay, I guess. But the whole talk was about comedy and about humor, so it's actually really interesting. Wow. You should have put that.
Nothing to do with the title.
Yeah. So he says basically people think Stoicism will make you all dour and boring, but actually there's a lot of comedy in Stoicism, and the main comedy that he points to, he says that, comedy is when you expect one thing and get another. Like, a lot of comedy is based on surprise. A classic knock knock joke. It's like, if it was like knock knock, who's there? Exactly who you expected to be there. That wouldn't be a very good joke. Or maybe it would be, because it subverts the structure of the knock knock joke. Anyway, but you get what I mean. It's based on surprise. So he talks specifically about the view from above, which is in his title. So, okay. But about how, like, this is an exercise which you probably did when you're on Stoic Week, which we'll talk about in a minute, where you sort of zoom out and look down at your life and the whole of the world from above. And he says there's an inherent comedy in the shift in perspective from, like, this is my life, everything's super important, I have to get to work on time, I have to do this, I have to do that. Like, all these everyday things that seem very important and immediate to us. But when you do the exercise of zooming out and looking down on your life and the whole world from a great distance, you see how insignificant all those things seem, and you get to laugh at yourself. And I think that's a great example of the natural comedy that arises from Stoicism. And in fact, there's again the next day in those lightning talks, a guy jumped up and spoke for 5 minutes about his research he'd been doing into Stoicism and how it impacts on people's lives. The guy called Tim LeBon, and he said he found that Stoics score really high on zest, meaning like great enthusiasm and energy. Like, that's one of the things that Stoicism can give you. So the idea that Stoics are dour and boring, completely debunked. We're great. We're so much fun.
No, that's good to hear. I'm glad that it doesn't make you boring.
That was the first day, and in the evening they had like in that lovely courtyard again. It's a lovely warm Mediterranean evening. All the herbs are smelling great. The wine is flowing freely. There's food out on these lovely tables with like white linen tablecloths. It's so fancy. Unfortunately, only olive tapenade for me, but there was some other vegan option. There were other non-vegan options for other people, and the tapenade was good. And got into conversations with other people who are interested in Stoicism. And I noticed this before when I've mixed with Buddhists. There's this way they have of speaking. It's like so slow and careful, and like they're really with you and paying attention to what you're saying. And it's really lovely. But also, as a kind of like neurotic British person, it's a bit intense.
It's scary. Yes, I have been around these people. Even being in I was in a place called Ubud recently, you might have heard of it. And everyone there is trying to be really, woke, is that the term that the kids are using? But, everyone's trying to be really, present and, spiritually sensitive. And it does give me anxiety, basically.
Yeah. It's like, why are you paying so much attention to me? Stop paying attention. Like, I always want to break it with making little jokes and...
just lowering the tone.
And then when you do that, they just look at you because they're not expecting. They're like, "Why are you doing that?" And they're like, "I'm sorry, right. I don't know how to do this thing that you're doing."
You magical demon, you.
It's really strange. Every time I meet someone like that, I'm compelled and I want to spend more time with them and have more conversations with them. But I also become acutely uncomfortable and over conscious of what I'm thinking and saying. And I guess I don't know. Yeah. maybe it's just our problem, but it's funny to notice that similarity in Stoics and Buddhists, because those are the two places I've seen it. Anyway, so that was, and then, but then I had a few free glasses of wine and, everything was fine. I didn't care anymore and had a merry old time. And then, we had the next day, which was Stoicon X. And I'm just going to give a very brief cover of that, but there were a couple of things I really wanted to point out. And the first one was this amazing woman, Catherine Koromilas, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Australian lady. And her talk was called Meditations on Meditations, towards a more Stoic kind of journaling. And it was so useful. So basically, she said, she's been running these groups, and what they do is they go through, they're like online groups on Facebook, I think, and they go through texts like meditations, like Marcus Aurelius' meditations, and they'll take like a section of it, like a paragraph, and they will think about it very deeply. And the way that they do that, because that's people always say, oh, read this and think about it, but how? But she has the how. So what she says is she has several exercises, but one of them is to just rewrite word for word, longhand. Yeah. Because that, it's a good way to absorb information. And then she talks about rephrasing it so it makes more sense to you, changing out words that don't make sense to you or seem a bit archaic, whatever. And then boiling it down, summarizing it in one sentence. And then she has people in her groups who are creating haikus out of these things and poetry, and just basically finding ways to get something really valuable for them that sticks with them out of the text. And I just thought it was such a clever way to interact with it, and something you could do with any text, not necessarily just Stoic text. Yeah. She talks about creating your own enchiridion, which is like the Stoic word for a little book of wisdom that you keep to yourself.
Cool.
So
wow.
Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, that's what that was, his enchiridion. I don't know if I'm saying that word quite right, but yeah, it's his little book of all the wisdom he had. I just thought it was a really good practical tip. There was the previous day, actually, Massimo Paolucci gave a talk which was full of practical tips, but I didn't go to that one, so I can't. But yeah, Stoics are good.
You didn't go to Massimo's talk?
I know, but there was one on Stoicism and creativity that sounded amazing, and, I've already read his book, so I was like, it's just going to be stuff from his book. So, yeah, I know. So, yeah, that was the thing that really struck me from that day, although there were a handful of really good talks. Generally, the whole thing, I think... It's funny, we talked about this when we talked about you being at the astrology conference. You get that feeling of unity when you're at a conference and being part of something bigger. And it really, it psyched me up to get more into Stoicism, just being around all these people. And also seeing how, like I said, Jonas, when that wrong slide came up, I know it's like a trivial thing, but just seeing that in action and seeing this guy who was he just rolled with it. And I was like, I would love to be able to just roll with it. That would be the best. So yeah, it was really inspiring. But I also had this sort of sense that maybe there's something about Stoicism, it's almost like self-help for people who are too cool for self-help. Does that make sense? Yeah. I don't think any of these guys would pick up, I don't know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus or anything. But they would pick up Marcus Aurelius.
I wonder if part of it is because it's old. I've been really interested in this with astrology as well, because what I'm studying is ancient astrology. And I wonder if part of the appeal is because it's old, it feels more real and authentic. And I wonder if it's the same with Stoicism, because a lot of these concepts are echoed in the regular old, new self-help world. But we like the fact that it's Marcus Aurelius. Anyway, that's just a theory.
I was waiting for a friend at a cafe yesterday, and I was just rereading Marcus Aurelius Meditations as preparation for this podcast. And I was reading it on my Kindle, and I was like, I'm gutted. I would love to be sitting in a posh cafe in London reading Marcus Aurelius so everyone could see. That would be much better.
Right, like an old falling apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but I did get this sense, especially, that these people wouldn't pick up self-help and would kind of see that self-help is a bit frivolous and silly, but this Stoicism as something in a different category. And we'll talk about later, maybe it is in a slightly different category, but there's definitely some similarity with a lot of the self-help stuff. So while I was, off in Athens, prancing around in a toga, you were actually practicing Stoicism, doing Stoic Week. How did that go?
Well, this is really interesting. I guess beforehand, I was a little bit scared that I wouldn't see it through. You know, it's a free 7-day course. Who sticks to free 7-day courses? Like, you normally need to have some skin in the game.
Yeah, well, it's called like a commitment device. That's what they call it, isn't it? When you pay for something, like if you pay for a gym membership, psychologically you're more likely to go because you've committed. Skin in the game. Yeah, exactly.
And it's not live. All of the content for each day is just available on an online learning platform called Teachable, for those who are interested. And it's up to you to show up every day and go to the website and whatever. I managed to do it every day. I didn't miss a day.
Oh, well
for whatever
done.
reason. And I think it's because, well, 2 reasons. It's a pretty well designed platform, so visually it's quite easy to use and friendly looking. The second thing is it wasn't that time consuming. I had the impression that because of the way it's laid out, so every day you're given a kind of morning exercise, an afternoon exercise, and an evening exercise. And I kind of thought, like, am I really going to do it at all those different times of the day? Okay, I'll admit I didn't. I only really did it in the morning. I went through the whole thing in the morning, and I don't see the disadvantage to doing that. I think I maybe missed a little bit by not kind of coming back to this thing every, 6 hours. But I still got a lot from just going through each day in the morning. So there's that. So Monday, we started with a quote from Epictetus. I worked out that I don't love Epictetus. He's my least favourite Stoic. What I did like about Monday was this midday exercise. Every day had a different theme. Oh, what was Monday's theme? That might have been the virtues. So that's when I learned about those 4 cardinal virtues that you described at the beginning: wisdom, courage, justice, moderation.
Yeah.
And the exercise was to take some time to think about how you could make progress towards caring better for yourself and others or your world, according to these virtues. So again, I like this kind of practical take on this, because when you first hear those virtues, you're like, what do I do with that?
Yeah, they're kind of abstract.
They are quite. So, like, again, like that journaling thing, it's kind of like, how do you put this into your own words? In the evening, we were asked to think about what we can learn from our friends about taking good care of yourself, others, in the world. And that I really liked. Just the idea of, like, who out of my friends, who's embodying some of these ideas.
That's really interesting, because that's how the first book in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, is like, I learnt from my father these things, I learnt from my mother these things. Yeah.
I think it's based on that. So every day, all of these different concepts are very closely based on mostly, I'd say those 3: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Tuesday.
Wait a minute, are you journaling this, or are you just meditating on it?
It depends what the exercise is. Some of them are like actual meditations, some of them are journaling things. I can't find my notes on that day. That was clearly all I did. But Tuesday, happiness. So apparently the Stoics saw happiness, or eudaimonia, good daimon or good spirit, as the overall goal of life. But it's different from our idea of happiness, which is often confused with the idea of pleasure, which I think is just a really important concept for me anyway. I should think for many people who, what isn't that part of like the American like motto?
Yeah,
or something?
life,
It's
liberty,
like
and the pursuit of happiness.
Right, and it's like, well, what does that mean? What does happiness mean? So here it's more that happiness is a way of living. And we're asked to think about what feels important to us, not just what gives us pleasure. And what do these things that feel important to us have in common? And I don't know, just recently I was talking to somebody about purpose and what that means. And one of their exercises to find your purpose or your meaning in life, your mission, is to do just that. Like, meditate on what feels important to you. It sounds simple, but I think that in itself is like a daily thing to come back to. But I just think it was a really important reframe on what happiness is.
Yeah.
And linking happiness to purpose is just like, of course, that sounds like it's going to make a lot of people's lives better. Wednesday was about virtues, and I've written here yawn. I think by this point I was like, I don't really want to look at the virtues this closely. but this is what this one led to. We were asked to draw up a list of what we think the most important qualities are for a good human life. So rather than Monday, where we were focusing on the existing cardinal virtues, we could think of our own and see how much does our list match the Stoic set of virtues. So the 4 that I ended up with were love, but as in agape, so it's almost like the universal love.
Okay. Yeah.
Mercy, so like it's almost a kind of, the way I see mercy, it's like, I'm going to forgive that person even though they don't really deserve it.
Yeah.
I did choose courage, so that is the same as one of the Stoic virtues. And the other one was presence, because with presence, I think you can cover off wisdom.
Oh yeah.
And you can cover, because it's like being focused on something. And it's also a nice thing to give to somebody else, and it's also really helpful for your state of mind. So presence, huge. The one thing that I remember I was journaling about was how self-control or moderation is the virtue that I value least.
Oh, really?
And I'll probably I'll keep coming back to this concept throughout the show, maybe, because that's the big Stoic idea that I can't really back as much as the others. What I liked was there was an introduction to the idea of the difference between virtues and preferred indifference. So virtues are genuinely good, and you probably know this, but preferred indifference are things like health and prosperity, which have a positive value in our lives, but are not like inherently good.
Yeah, and I think the indifferent part of it is referring to it's things that we can't affect. Like, we don't have control over these things. So, like, if it happens, it's nice, but we don't really have control. And especially, like, maybe we have more control over our health now than the Stoics did because we have modern medicine. But, you know, obviously it's nicer not to have cancer. But if you have cancer, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything to cause it. It's not something, it's out of your control. So.
Exactly. And then we were asked to think about the occasions when we aimed or could aim at acting virtuously rather than trying to get external things or those preferred indifference. Again, a really great exercise just to do, maybe even daily or weekly. So, you know, I listed some ideas like helping somebody you love for no reason other than because you love them, forgiving someone even if they've wronged you, doing the scary thing because it's right, even if you risk looking like a fool. I was doing them.
That's a big one for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it's just a useful thing. And my last one was putting your own preferences aside to be present with someone and truly listen to them. Which, you know, I mean, easier said than done, right? These are more like directives for me, so that I can put my own virtues into place. That was the idea. Thursday was about community, which I was really interested in. Like, how are they going to bring an ancient light to this idea of community? And we learned something called the circles of Heracles. And again, I've kind of come across this before in guided meditations, but it's a meditation where you're kind of picturing a circle of light surrounding your body. And, you know, you can see where this is going.
Yeah.
The circle of light is going to expand out. It's going to encompass members of your family, just general people in daily life, to everyone in the country, to the whole world. Sounds a lot like metta, you know, loving kindness meditation, which I'm a big fan of. I really think that any meditation that kind of does something like this kind of like expansive feeling connected with love or like well-wishing is just hugely helpful. And it's so cool to think, you know, they were doing it way back then, and it's just, it works. Can't deny it. Friday was emotions. So we were called to think of an occasion where we reacted in a way that we see now as wrong or misguided. And then you might think that you were justified in behaving like this. But basically the idea was that we'd have to remind ourselves that happiness does not depend on other people's valuation of our status, but on what we do for ourselves to develop the virtues and put them into practice. So it's this idea that you're kind of trying to reprogram
yourself.
Yeah, and like reassess or how you respond to the responses of others, basically. Yeah. Something else that they talk about was the idea of good emotions. So not all emotions are bad. This is the big takeaway here. I didn't realise this. I kind of thought, Stoics don't like emotions. All emotions are bad. Can't have any of them. But some of the ones that they consider as good are joy. And I think that's a really interesting word, because the word enjoyment it's not pleasure. Enjoyment is almost like, somebody who climbs up a mountain, they're not having fun. That's not pleasurable, but it is enjoyable. There's like an inherent, it's kind of connected to that meaning thing.
Yeah, kind of like fulfillment, maybe. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great word. And it's that caution, as in avoiding what is bad or a vice, but it's not unnecessary fear or anxiety. Again, really useful concept, the distinction there. And wish, and I was like, what is wish? And that's wishing to gain what is genuinely good, so the virtues, not the material things or the preferred indifference.
Okay, yeah.
So you can have all of those things, and I was like, oh, good, I can still have enjoyment, I can still have like logical caution, and I can still, wish is a nice word, but I would say desire. I can still want things, right? It's just that I'm wanting what's genuinely good. And there is the concept that these good emotions are dependent on knowledge of the virtues, apparently. Seneca says, a person is not capable of joy unless he is brave, unless he is just, unless he has self-control.
Yeah, that is the basic idea. Like, you can't have eudaimonia, you can't have well-being or happiness without, the only way to get that is through the virtues. That's like...
I think that... Yeah, what do you think of that? Because I think that's something that I'd have to sit with for a while and just, look at from a lot of different angles just to be sure of that.
I don't know,
I'm sure they're right, but...
I think it's interesting that so many... We're going to talk in a little bit about Buddhism, but there are lots of different practices and, philosophies from all around the world at all different times that do seem to come back to something like, sometimes expressed differently, but those 4 virtues. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's because they are genuinely important things in human life and, for human flourishing and stuff. So I don't know if I'd be willing to say that is literally the only way you can be happy. That seems a bit extreme. But definitely, as far as looking for routes to be happy, I think if you follow that, you're going to do better than someone who doesn't, maybe.
Yeah, agreed. Saturday was maybe my favourite day. So resilience was the theme. And this is maybe my favourite facet of Stoic philosophy, where I think maybe most benefits are to be found, at least for me. So Stoics would classically expose themselves both mentally and emotionally to future catastrophes, which is kind of like exposure therapy and CBT, which maybe we'll talk about later. But apparently you don't even need to expose yourself to the actual thing if you can get yourself into the right feeling state. So the exercise was called premeditation of adversity, which you could spend, they suggest 20 to 30 minutes on this daily, which seems like a lot. I don't know if I want to put myself through that level of stress every day. But the first thing is thinking about the situation. So what's the upsetting situation you're imagining? Second is your emotions. So how does this make you feel when you picture it as if it's happening right now? How strong is the feeling? So you're rating it on a 0 to 100% scale. Duration. How long in minutes did you manage to sit with it and expose yourself to the uncomfortable situation? Consequence. How strong was the upsetting feeling at the end of that session? So what did you,
I really like that because it's like you're getting a measure of whether the process actually worked or not.
Yeah, the whole thing is it only works. The whole exercise is, can you see how it works? It's you're asking yourself oh, this isn't so bad, maybe.
So did they give an example of what sort of, did they give an example of what sort of thing you should be thinking about? Or do you want to talk about what you were thinking about? Just to make it more real.
Yeah, let me think. So it could be having a job interview.
Okay.
And you're imagining, so that you have to go through this situation, and you're imagining that worst case scenario, it's going to tank and it's going to be really terrible. You're going to say the wrong thing. And that's making you, and I think I can feel something like that and instantly move into the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
You know, and then once you're there, rather than kind of like, so I think the problem is when we do have these moments of premeditated like anxiety, our bodies are like responding to it, but our mind is like yelling at our body, being like, nope, not allowed to feel like that. Stop it. And it doesn't help. It doesn't make it go away.
Yeah.
So a lot of people do tell you to do is like, okay, go into that feeling, but without dwelling on it, without making it bigger. This is kind of like almost in a slightly detached way to sort of sit with that feeling and be like, how bad is this really? How long can I sit with this? I found out recently that emotions themselves only last for 90 seconds. It's the mind after that that prolongs it.
Whoa, that sounds like a really unfalsifiable claim. Like, how do you know how long emotions? Sorry to be a bummer, but no,
I assume the person who told me knew.
I get, but I like the thing of like taking it apart and asking yourself questions about it, because if it was just like sit down and think about something bad that might happen for 30 minutes every day, that's just rumination. That's just teaching you to like become a neurotic mess.
The thing is, you're not necessarily thinking about the situation. You're kind of almost, I mean, from that I got that you're kind of sitting with the feeling itself. Like you're judging it by, how bad am I really feeling about this like image, this fantasy image? You're not necessarily making the situation, you know what, you're not solving it. You're not trying to solve it in your mind. And I think that's that thing that keeps us in that state of anxiety. It's like we're trying to solve the problem. We're like, anyway, it's making me anxious just thinking about it. But and they do say if your anxiety level hasn't reduced to at least half its peak level at the end, you might want to pick an easier subject, which I think is a really good thing to state at the end, because, you know, some issues are pretty big for people.
Yeah.
I also really love this quote at the end. Seneca, it probably is my favourite, I realise. So, at the end of the day, you go to bed saying this: glad and cheerful, let us say, as we go to our rest, I have finished living, I have run the course that fortune has set for me. If God gives us another day, let us receive it with joy. The happiest person, who owns himself more fully, is the one who awaits the next day without anxiety. It's interesting. I'm like, I bet you're like, you know, maybe that's not for everyone. He's talking about God giving us another day. I mean, maybe not everyone's going to get behind that, but I think it's quite lovely.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how differently we respond to, like, because there is a lot of God language in all of this stuff. And I think a lot of atheists or agnostic Stoics just replace God with fate or, you know, the universe or whatever, and kind of carry on like that, which is what I've been doing when I've been reading it and not facing. In fact, that the journaling lady, who's Catherine, I can't remember her surname now, but anyway, that lady, she specifically said that she's an atheist and she can't be doing with all this metaphysical nonsense, basically. And that was part of her process of going through the text and finding other words that she could put in or other concepts and figuring out what was right for her. And that's why I really liked that approach, because she wasn't like, you know, she wasn't precious about it. She was like, this is a practical philosophy and we have to make it work for us. Let's figure out let's engage with it seriously and take it seriously. But it doesn't mean we have to start, you know, believing things that we don't think have evidence for them, which is comforting for me to hear.
I'm rolling my eyes. But no, I my question is, what percentage do you think, I mean, how could you possibly know, but do you think most people at that conference and most people in the Stoic movement are atheist? Like,
yeah, I don't know.
What impression do you get?
I think probably among the hipsters. So you remember the two groups, the chalky old uncles and the hipsters. I think the hipsters are probably mainly atheists, but I think there's probably some deists among the chalky old uncles, definitely. Yeah. Okay. The other division that I thought about that cuts through both groups is, and this is similar with skepticism, maybe it's similar with all movements, within the Stoic community, it seems to me like there's a bunch of people who are just naturally quite calm, and they hear about Stoicism and they're like, oh, that's what I've been doing all my life. Now there's a word for it.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole bunch of people who, like me, are just like a neurotic mess, and they really need Stoicism. And the way that they relate to all the texts and stuff is completely different to the people who are like, oh, this just puts into words my way of living. Yeah. So it's a really diverse community, much more diverse than any of the other communities that I've been involved in that, like much more diverse than skepticism or atheism or veganism. Like there's people with also different values and metaphysical ideas about the world, but they're kind of coming together around, I guess, around the practical application of Stoicism.
Yeah, I love that.
Just hearing you talk about Stoic Week, I really like the fact that they're trying to get these ideas not just into your head, but like into your way of life. I guess that's probably
Definitely.
why they were suggesting you did it 3 times in one day. So it's like it becomes part of you instead of just something you read. Because I feel like often when I'll read something and it'll just sort of float across the top of my brain and not really stick.
Yeah. Part of the reason, so you weren't really repeating the whole thing. It was like there would be a morning thing, an afternoon thing, and an evening thing.
Okay,
I just happened to do it all in one go. But I agree. It's like, and you could keep repeating this by all means. So the last day, Sunday, was nature. And this is the idea that reflecting on nature can help us be better people. This idea that, we're all connected, so we should give a crap. And the guided meditation was the view from above. So that's the one that you mentioned. So seeing yourself. And I really, this is the meditation that stuck with me most. I was in a hotel room at the time, and like, it just felt, I'm not normally that great with guided meditations, but I really saw this one. I could really see myself on the bed from the other side of the room. I could really see myself from the top of the building looking into the room and just expanding out from that. And again, it's like, it's seeing yourself as a speck in this grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
I found it very helpful. I felt a lot of like compassion for myself and for others, and feeling like I should care less about minor things. Just things that I would want to cultivate every day. The only fault was about all of the guided meditations was the Scottish guy on recordings.
Oh,
I
no.
don't like Scottish accents. Maybe no, but I like Scottish accents. I mean, I was great with that, but it was just an interesting choice.
Yeah, especially
so-
since presumably there's going to be quite a lot of Americans engaging with this material and might find
Right,
the
I
accent
was
a bit difficult.
surprised. Yeah. So in overall, my summary, really good, short and sweet and manageable. My highlights were thinking about my own virtues, because I'd thought about values before, but I actually think virtues seems to be a better word for me, and I like that there are only 4. It's easy to remember. That premeditation on challenges, I think that is really useful, and that idea of kind of like, I have been doing that a bit since as well, and I have noticed that you almost desensitize yourself to that particular event by repeating that exercise. It's really interesting. The idea of like that big picture, taking a big picture on things, the view from above, feeling connected and more indifferent to the fluctuations of the world and of my mind. Like I said, I'm not a fan of downplaying passion so much. I think it's a really helpful part of life. So, letting ourselves feel those strong emotions, and when helpful, we should act on them.
Yeah.
I think some of the best art is created from strong feels. And that's, I think the important thing is how we use our emotions. And if we're acting on them in a harmful way to ourselves or others or to our world, obviously not good. And that's when the Stoic stuff is great. But don't be getting rid of all the desire and passion in the world. It would be sad.
Yeah, but you did say that they were one of the things they talked about was joy, and what was it, wish? So that's kind of passions. They're the passions that are allowed, the good ones.
I know. I don't know. It's just temperance.
It's not a sexy word, is it?
It's not. Anyway, after trying to live like a Stoic for a week, I was inspired to find out a bit more about what those ancient guys in togas believed.
Yeah, but before you open those dusty old history books...
This show has already taken us to some strange places, literally and metaphysically, and we love making it for you.
If you enjoy listening and have $1 a month to spare, we'd appreciate your support on Patreon.
Patreon is a platform for supporting content creators like us.
If you pledge $1 a month, we'll spend it on boring things like hosting fees and audio equipment.
And fun things like psychic readings, crystal healing, ayahuasca retreats.
Yeah, we'll spend it on drugs.
There are lots of adventures we'd like to go on, so if you want us to go hunting for the Loch Ness Monster, visit a haunted castle or Area 51, you're going to have to chip in.
We think having conversations about this stuff, paranormal, spiritual, weird stuff, is really important, especially between people who don't agree. Having these experiences is fun, doing the research is interesting, but the most important thing is the conversations.
We hope listening to our podcast will inspire you to start talking to people you would normally dismiss as grumpy old skeptics.
Or flaky woo-woo seekers.
If you think these sorts of conversations are important too, you can support us on Patreon. And as a supporter, for as little as $1, you'll be able to vote on upcoming show ideas.
And if there's something you're desperate for us to look into, whether it's acupuncture or vampires, Patreon supporters' requests will always go to the top of our consideration list.
Find out more at patreon.com/Seeker Skeptic. And that's Patreon spelt Patreon. So, like you said at the beginning, Stoicism was founded in Athens by Zeno. One thing that you left out, which I just wanted to bring up, was how he died. Do you know this story?
Oh, I don't know. Please tell me.
So, he apparently died around 262 or 261 BC, and Diogenes Laertius tells this kind of strange tale that Zeno tripped and fell, leaving the school or whatever one day, and he broke a toe. But because he was a Stoic's age and he was quite old, I think he would have been around 72, he felt it was appropriate to just call it a day and, consequently strangled himself.
Oh my God!
How did you not come across this story? I know, but I've heard that repeated, so I've got enough grounds to believe it. But
that's so
I think
strange.
there are a lot of there should be a little book of big Stoic deaths.
Yeah.
I think that there were some pretty interesting ones. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that there was a kind of difference between the very early Stoics and the later Stoics. And I get the impression that, well, for one, Zeno's worldview would have been kind of closer to that of Taoism, Hindu Vedanta, or some varieties of Sufism than to Orthodox Christianity or Islam. And it's interesting that, I guess, as you go on later, the Christian ideas get in there a bit more. But also this idea that the doctrines of Zeno, he was basically a little bit more easygoing. So the view that men and women should be considered equals and even wear the same clothes.
Oh, that's awesome. That's very early
Yeah.
to be expressing those sort of views in his society.
Yeah. And the idea that women should be held in common, which basically is the promotion of free love. And the acceptability of sexual practices such as masturbation, homosexuality, and prostitution.
Oh, wow.
Strangely enough, not adultery, though. Not
He draws a line there, yeah.
Yeah, and I quite liked all of this stuff and the discouragement of excessive modesty. So there are just some other ideas that felt a bit more like I said, the kind of loosey-goosey. Whereas the later Stoics, especially when it became popular in ancient Rome, Epictetus in particular seems to be kind of strict. Did you get that impression?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't actually read so much of him. I've only read little bits and pieces of him. And like you, I was just like, oh, this guy's not for me.
Yes, exactly. And the other thing is just that what I think is interesting is that less than 1% of the Stoics' originals writings now survive.
Wow.
Which is nuts.
Yeah.
And that none of them are self-help books, are they? They're for Seneca, it was letters. For Epictetus, it was lectures. And with Marcus Aurelius, it was his diary. So people now are piecing together these Stoic principles from the surviving documents. And I just can't help but wonder, what else was there? What else were they saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's madly frustrating to me that we've got so much from these. I don't know how many thinkers there are. I mean, these are the three main guys, but there are definitely more people and more evidence that we've got of their work. But it's just so little. It's really upsetting.
What I like about what we do have is because Marcus Aurelius is his personal diary, as you said, and Seneca is the letters. It's stuff that they weren't writing. I guess there's pros and cons to this, but because they weren't writing it to be consumed, they weren't writing a self-help book, they were writing to their friend or to themselves, it feels a bit more, there's less likely to be any pretension involved, you know? Like, you don't pretend stuff in your diary, you just write what you genuinely think is useful. And like, you could be trying to impress your friend, I guess, but from the letters, the impression I get is it's very like, this is what these people were really thinking, and there's no bullshit involved, which I really like. Whereas
yeah, that's true.
When something's been packaged up, maybe it's more helpful because it's been packaged up with like thinking about what a consumer will get out of it, but then you also lose that immediacy.
It's almost like I would love to we should publish at some point people's emails. Like I want to see the emails that, you know, the thinkers that I love to read today, you know, when people ask them questions, what are they emailing back?
Yeah, that's going to happen. God, I mean, like 2,500 years it'll be Tim Ferriss's emails.
I was going to say, and speaking of Tim Ferriss, I thought it would be good to transition to the modern day Stoic bros. So people like Tim Ferriss, who made an audiobook of Seneca's letters, and that was, like I said, that was my first entrance into Stoicism, really. And then you've also got Ryan Holiday, who's author of The Ego is the Enemy.
Oh, yeah. His new book, we all got a copy at Stoicon. I haven't had a chance to sit down and read it yet. Stillness is the Key is the new title.
Yeah. It just rubs me up the wrong way for some reason.
I haven't read any of his work.
Yeah. But the rise of modern Stoicism has basically received a lot of attention since around November 2012, and that was the first annual Stoic Week. But I mean, when I was looking into this, apparently it traces back to the roots of the work of Dr. Albert Ellis. Have you heard of him?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about him in a minute.
Yeah, and he was the one who developed that rational emotive behavior therapy.
Yeah.
And Aaron T. Beck, who was the father of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You've also got people like even Viktor Frankl, who found Stoicism useful when he was imprisoned in the Nazi concentration camp. And he went on to develop logotherapy. But nowadays, I think a lot of people are getting their Stoic knowledge not on the porch, but through podcasts. So you've got people like Justin Bakula of the Stoic Solutions podcast, the Practical Stoic podcast hosted by Simon Drew, the Sunday Stoic, and that's the one that I listen to actually. But yeah, there are lots. As well as like blogs, Massimo Pigliucci,
I think.
William Irvine.
Yeah, that's the book that I recommended to you when we first started talking about that. What is it? The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy by William Irvine. That's the first book I read on Stoicism, and I thought it was just a brilliant overview, and that's what I'd recommend to listeners. To maybe to get you started if you don't want to jump in the deep end with the actual text. I just thought he gave a great overview. For sure.
And also like YouTube. I mean, when I was trying to learn a bit more about Stoicism, you've got so much content out there. And
I should mention that all the talks that I've been talking about, they're going to put them up on the Modern Stoicism YouTube channel. So if you want to see the talks and the talks from the previous Stoicons as well, I don't think they do every single one, but a lot of them are up there. We'll put a link in the show notes.
That's really cool. I will definitely check those out. And naturally, I was quite interested in some of the subgroups that have like cropped up within Stoicism. So I was reading that Massimo was kind of complaining that we've got this avalanche of Stoicism for business and Stoicism for success. And there is something a little bit like perverted about that. It's almost like we don't like it when spiritual things get, stolen for these purposes that maybe we think are a bit more, we should just keep certain things sacred, and Stoicism is one of those things. He also mentions that there's a kind of apparent popularity in Stoicism in the men's rights movement.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, and allied sub-movements like incels, MGTOW, and so on.
Men going their own way, yeah.
Yes, and he also mentions our friend Jordan Peterson as well in some of these Stoics circles.
Actually,
so
Jordan Peterson was cited as a reference. I can't remember which talk, but I noticed his name come up as a reference at one of the talks, and I was like, noted, okay.
Yeah, and I think it's just generally like Stoicism by these people are associated, and I think a lot of people outside of that as well are associated with manliness, and that like courage is inherently manliness. But it's like, I don't know. What I found interesting was I was talking to my dad about Stoicism, and he kind of said quite quickly, it's quite like a masculine thing, isn't it? And I remember thinking, oh, like you're not even like you're in that category. You're an old white man. And you can recognize that there is something inherently kind of mannish about this. I just wonder I wonder what women think about that. Because, I mean, apparently I'm one, you're one, and we like this Stoicism thing, but we're not good examples. So.
Well, I wondered if, I was thinking, for me, I don't have so much of a problem, like temperance comes naturally to me. I'm a bit, I'm unlikely to start a confrontation because I'm, that's scary and horrible. And I need more focus on the courage element, personally, because I'm I'm a bit of a scaredy cat and I don't like confrontations. And I wonder whether there's, people say, and I think the evidence bears this out, that generally women are more agreeable than men. And who knows whether that's socialized or, a biological thing. That's a whole other topic. But women's natural agreeableness, I find myself in inverted commas, I find myself fighting with that, because I do want to agree and go, and make people feel good around me. So I need more courage. And if men are naturally less agreeable and more aggressive, which in my experience seems about right, then they need more of the temperance. So maybe that's why why the focus in Stoicism is more on self-control and emotional control, because if the majority of people practicing Stoicism today are men, which seems to be the case, then they need more of that. And if there were more women in the movement, maybe there'd be more focus on courage. I don't know.
No, so I'm going to make the exact opposite, not the exact opposite argument, but just say that, first of all, courage is not the same as assertiveness or aggressiveness or, agreeableness. It's not that. It's something else altogether. You could say that a woman who's giving birth is that's probably the most courageous thing.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Maybe you could, maybe not the most courageous, but that and going to war maybe. But then you've got this idea that maybe, just to be controversial, let's say women are more emotional. And maybe we need Stoicism more. I don't know. There are weird arguments to be made for all of this. But I do think one thing that does seem to be true is the people who came up with this were, old white men.
Yeah.
And I think, you could say, sure, there were maybe women Stoics. You don't see many of them.
Well, yeah, we don't know what women were thinking or writing down at that time, or even if they were, able to write, because they may well not have been educated. It's who knows what they were up to.
But it's interesting to see nowadays. I mean, I would like to know how many of the speakers were women, and maybe that's something that's going to develop. But
yeah, there were only a couple of female speakers at the event. The host was a woman. I mean, that, like I said, that doesn't really bother me. I feel quite comfortable in that sort of space. But I do think that there is a different perspective, that comes from being a woman in our society. And it would be nice to see more. In fact, I'm actually going to talk in a minute about a woman who wrote a book, How Buddhist is Stoicism? How Buddhist is Stoicism? And but she's not really a Stoic. In fact, she makes a point of saying that she's not a Stoic. She's just interested in the ideas. So I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I do worry to some degree, because I think these people are they're really nice people, and I think they have really good ideas. And I worry that they're kind of vulnerable to a kind of unfair critique about being not inclusive or something.
Yeah.
Which is not their aim at all.
No, it doesn't seem to be like that from the outside. I've never felt like this is a hard thing to approach as a woman. It's more like what's your taste? If you've got a taste for this,
Yeah.
It's. So, I'm done with my history and modern day assessment. Tell me more about the sciencey stuff.
Oh, well, let me do Buddhism first, since we were on that. Because this is the woman I heard speak last year. In fact, actually, I'll put a link in the show notes to her talk at Stoicon last year. And the talk was called How Buddhist is Stoicism. Her book is called More Than Happiness, Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age. And it's a really good read. But if you're interested, then look at the talk. And when you look at the talk, in the beginning shot where they show a wide shot of the audience, you can see the back of my head. So if any listener wants to take a screenshot of that, figure out who I am and circle it and send it to us in an email. We'll mention you on the podcast or send you a present or something as a little prize, like a Where's Wally?
I was going to say
my head is in the audience. Where's Waldo? I think they call it in America, don't they? So. There was a person in this conference, the one that I just went to, in the lightning presentations, who was a Buddhist guy, and he said his short presentation was about Buddhism and Stoicism and how they intersect. And he said, I thought this is really good. It's not an apples to apples comparison. It's more like oranges to lime, because they're both citrus and they both provide vitamin C. And I was like, that's really cute. But I couldn't help thinking, right, interesting he chose lime. Is he saying Stoics are a bit bitter, you know? Anyway.
What would it be? Oranges and lemons?
Yeah, oranges to lime. Yeah, oranges and lemons.
Why didn't he choose lemon? Lemons would be more bitter than lime, so it was nicer than that.
Yeah, I guess. Anyway. Yeah, at least it wasn't lemons. But so what I learned from reading Antonio Marocco's book is that back in that time when the early Stoics were talking, when they were hanging out on their painted porches and everything, basically the way we think of the East and the West as being separate spheres, that wasn't the way it was back then. It was more like a single interactive cultural sphere. That's the phrase that she's used. She's taking that from Stephen Batchelor, who is a secular Buddhist teacher who I really admire. So again, we're already seeing overlaps just in using the same reference material. So we have Gautama Buddha, in theory, was active around 500 BC, and Zeno is 300 BC. So the ideas of Buddhism have been around for a couple of hundred years before Zeno gets to Athens and starts talking about Stoicism. And basically what Antonia did in her talk is she said, because she's an atheist, as I said, and a kind of a skeptical thinker, she said, if you get rid of the metaphysics of Stoicism and Buddhism and look at what's left, you see very similar ideas. They're basically both an analysis and treatment of the human condition. So in Buddhism, there's the idea that life is dukkha, which is usually translated to suffering, but that's a bit harsh. It's more like unsatisfactoriness. You can never be... There's always something slightly unsatisfactory in life, and that's the very nature of it. And the Buddhists think that dukkha is caused by getting caught up in worldly delusions, like gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. So those are things that the Stoics would describe as indifference, things you can't control. And both the Stoics and the Buddhists basically come to the conclusion that the treatment to this situation of dukkha, or, unsatisfactoriness, is that you have to understand the state of the world and your own mind and act virtuously. So to do that sounds easy, right? But to do that, you need to train yourself with mental discipline. So that's the kind of Stoic exercises you've been doing on Stoic Week. And for Buddhists, it would be like the metta bhavana, loving kindness meditations and insight meditations and all those, mental training things that are based around meditations. So they're basically, they have very different, the core ideas are very similar. They're dressed up in different ways and they have different metaphysics. But the actual, how a Stoic lives and how a Buddhist lives are quite similar. The guy who came up in the lightning talks, the Buddhist guy, he said, I don't need to teach you about Buddhism because if you're a good Stoic, then you're a good Buddhist. That's a simple way to sum it up.
That's cool.
Yeah, and the other funny thing is that they both spawn modern therapeutic practices. So Buddhism, we now have mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and we have this whole big mindfulness movement, which we'll probably end up talking about in our meditation episode. And And Stoicism is the inspiration for, like you said earlier, rational emotive behavioral therapy, which has sort of morphed and become CBT now. It was like the first kind of CBT invented by, as you said, Albert Ellis in the 1950s. And it was inspired by that quote from Epictetus, like one of the most famous ones: men are disturbed not by things, but by the views with which they take of them. So it's that idea, like, what happens to you isn't the problem. It's how you respond to it is the problem. Which...
So great. I mean, it's more, it's just like nowadays we've turned all of these things into like little Instagram quotes. Oh, and I'm guilty of this myself, but it's really important just to give them some time and actually try to do practices around these ideas. I think they're everything.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking we could work through a little REBT right now. And this is inspired by a talk on the second day at Stoicon X by, I'm never going to get this name right, this is one of the other women who was speaking. There were a few women, actually. Chrysula Kostogiannasis, the interface between Stoic philosophy and REBT. And she gave us basically an overview of REBT and how it works and stuff. And it sounded to me very similar to what I did when I was practicing CBT in therapy. She said, there's an activating event. You can think of that as the stimulus. That's the something bad happening. Then there's the self-expression, which Stoics would call the impression. So that's how you emotionally respond to it, what's going on in your head. And then there's the reaction, which might be lashing out, or it might be feeling sad, or it might be, I don't know, could be anything, right? Responding in some way. And so she breaks it down into those three categories, A, B, and C. And the whole point of REBT is to challenge the middle bit, the self-expression, like what's going on inside you. So this is the example I thought of that we could try and work through. If listeners would like to go to, I think it's the US iTunes review website for our podcast, you'll see that there's several lovely 5-star reviews, but when I just last checked it, there's only one written review where someone's written something, and it's a Wiccan lady, and she says something along the lines of, I didn't like this, I found it offensive to my religion, presumably because she listened to the episode on Wicca and didn't like what we said. And that's the negative event. That's our negative event that we're going to be working through in this little...
It's really upsetting, guys.
It is, because I really love Wicca, and I really care about, like, I think...
People.
I care about people, and it's specifically because it's around Wicca. I'm like, no, but these are my people. I don't want them to not like me just because I don't believe in the same things they do. I still think they're cool and interesting and amazing people. So that's the negative iTunes review, is our activating event, our stimulus. So the next step is B, what's going on our heads. And this, the way the REBT people think about it, is it's a bunch of statements and beliefs. So I'll give you some of the ones that come up in my head, and then you can see what you've got. So the sort of things I'm thinking are, I've upset this person, I should never upset people because everyone should like me. Everyone is going to think that we're rude and insensitive to Wicca and that we're nasty people. And the third thought or belief that I have, and it's weird to talk about these as beliefs because they're not like logical evidence beliefs, they're just things that come up in me. But belief is the term that she used in this talk. Unless everyone likes me, I'm a horrible person. That's like the core belief, like everyone must like me. And obviously all those beliefs or ideas that are very deep in my head provoke massive anxiety.
Can I tell you mine?
Yeah, please do.
Well, because she's a Wicca, I guess she can cast spells.
Oh my God, I didn't even think of that.
Is that we're going to get cursed, and like the podcast will just, no one will listen to it anymore, and that will mean that we can't do it anymore or something, and that's upsetting.
Yeah, it's like catastrophizing, like the absolute worst case scenario that could possibly come from this one.
It keeps spiraling, and then you keep adding to it, and that's just what the mind does.
So what REBT practitioners would do with these things is to ask how rational these ideas that we have are. So my idea that I should never upset people because everyone should like me. I mean, if I think about that logically, that's pretty unrealistic. And in fact, if you want to have ideas in the world and talk openly about them, some people aren't going to like them. That's a fact of life. So the idea that everyone should like me is not a good belief to have deep down in my psyche. Everyone will think we're rude or insensitive to Wicca, and therefore that we're nasty. So is everyone going to agree with this woman? Is everyone going to read this one comment and then just not look at any other evidence and agree with it? That's probably pretty unlikely. And unless everyone likes me, I'm a horrible person. That's obviously some deep childhood trauma type shit. But again, it's not logical. It's not a logical belief. There are many people who I think are brilliant people who, I'm just trying to think of examples. Like even if we think of the Stoics, there are people who didn't like those ancient Stoic guys, right? I mean, they got exiled. Some of them were put to death. Lots of people didn't like them, but we still think they're good people. So your personal evaluation of whether you're a good person or not, it's completely illogical to base it on whether everyone likes you. And the standard of, if everyone likes me, if one person doesn't like me, then I'm a horrible person is, I mean, it's just when you start picking it apart, which is what
doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Your idea that she might put a curse on us, I'd say that's
I can't find any problem with that. But let's say the logic there is the fact that the lack of logic is that just because she didn't like a podcast, she would decide to curse us. Like that's not necessarily logical either.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually quite insulting to her, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
I'm sure she's forgotten completely about it. That's the other thing. Like we're assuming, or at least I'm assuming, I'll speak for myself, that she's still in that place, that angry place. And it wasn't even a particularly angry comment. It was just, but she still believes all of those things and doesn't like us. For all we know, she might have changed her mind. She might have never thought about it again. She probably moved on with her life. I'm sure she's got much more important things in her life than the podcast she listened to once. So, yeah. So the idea is the next step. You analyze those statements and beliefs and look at whether they're logical or not. Ours really aren't logical. Then you replace them with better ones so that the scenario ABC goes a bit better. So we get the negative iTunes review, and instead of all the beliefs and ideas that we had in our house previously, we program ourselves to think sensible things like, if you want to have conversations about emotive topics, sometimes you're going to upset people, but it's worth it because conversations enrich the world. Or no one's judging your whole character on a single iTunes review. Or it's more important to be honest than liked.
I've got one.
Okay.
No one cares as much as you think they do.
Yes, that's great.
I love that one.
Yeah. So you can see that if we go negative iTunes review, then instead of the irrational, mad, negative thoughts we have these positive, rational thoughts, then the result, instead of anxiety and not being able to sleep because you're thinking about this woman who doesn't like us out there somewhere, you're going to reach a state of equanimity, which is what the Stoics are all about, right? So I think it's really I'm making it sound a lot simpler than it is, and I think people should go away and read about REBT and maybe think about, doing it if they have negative thoughts that influence the way they behave. But the idea of simply breaking it down and saying, there's something that happens in the world. There's your beliefs, and then there's the way you respond, or there's your beliefs and statements, your ideas. The point of intervention is at those ideas. You can't stop bad things happening. You can't stop yourself reacting to them. But what you can change is the framework which you interpret the stuff that happens. And if you keep up a Stoic practice, and there are many books which will help you to do that, like Massimo Pellucci's book is actually really good. His newest book, I can't remember what it's called, but you'll find it if you give it a search. I'll put it in the show notes. With practical exercises like the ones Kat did on Stoic Week, where you can actually reprogram those really deep ideas you have about the world and about how you should interact with the world so that you can have a more positive experience. I just think I know it's an overused word, but it's super empowering, right?
Right, completely. And it's interesting to me how much it's really impacted the work of so many people. Speaking of the work, I'm thinking of Byron Katie as you were going through that, and her exercises are really great tools to really help on that particular part about, not believing everything you think.
Yes.
And really helping you challenge those thoughts that lead us to suffering.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about the dichotomy of control, about being very clear about what you can control and what you can't control. And I'm feeling like in this moment, what I can control is asking the listeners, if you feel like it, we'd love a 5-star review and some nice comments to balance out that one negative one. That would be really nice.
I mean, we're trying to be really stoic about it, but it actually would mean a lot to us. So.
Yeah. So, overall, I think, I mean, it's a really, I'm going to say it's a really young movement, but obviously it's not a young movement, it's a very old movement. But it's sort of still at that point where it's deciding where it wants to be, where this modern Stoicism revival wants to be. One of the people I met actually in the evening, we were chatting about it, and he said something like the self-help version of Stoicism, like that you were saying about Stoicism for Buddhism and things, is kind of bastardized. Like it's like you were saying, it's kind of almost like we shouldn't mess up our sacred Stoicism with all these things. And I think that is something that is a concern. I understand why they're concerned, because this, I mean, we've spoken before about other self-helpy type things, and I'm always like, self-help is just, there was a book I read actually called Sham, how the self-help and actualization movement made America helpless. It's an interesting book. It's a little bit out of date now. I can't remember when it was published, but the guy who wrote it was a self-help book editor, and he noticed that the most likely customer for a book on any given topic was someone who had bought a similar book within the preceding 18 months. And this led him to think, oh, this isn't really working, because if it was working, people wouldn't keep coming back for more. And I do think there's something in that. There's a quote from Seneca, and this obviously has really influenced the way that they put together Stoic Week. He said, just as some dyes are readily absorbed by the wool, others only after repeated soaking and simmering. So are some studies that show up well in our minds as soon as we have learned them. This one, though, referring to Stoicism, must permeate us thoroughly. It must soak in, giving not just a tinge of colour, but a real deep dye, or it cannot deliver on any of its promises. It's kind of, I mean, to go back to AA, it's like it works if you work it.
It does. I mean, my only defense about all of this is that, same with that, it's a process that you don't just do once. And I think it's the same with self-help. I don't think you read one self-help book and be like, well, I'm fixed. It's like, no, it is a process that you keep going. And of course you keep buying self-help books. And maybe the type of self-help books you buy change. I've actually seen that happen in myself. I'm still basically buying in that category, but the lessons I don't buy the same thing about like time management over and over again, because you do learn, but at the same time it's not like I'm ever going to be done. I don't think that's the point. I don't think you're ever meant to be just like done as a human.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, being a human is like constant growth, but I feel like I have done that. I got really stuck on minimalism for a while and just read every book about minimalism. And I got to a point where I was like, I haven't really changed that much about my life. I've just got a lot of stuff. Yeah, I've got all the books. Because it kind of gives you that burst of inspiration. You feel really good about yourself and really optimistic, like, yeah, I'm going to change my life. Oh, it's going to be so much better. And then within like a little while, it was worn off and you're like, oh, just pick up the next one, I think people do get into that situation if they don't actually, put the stuff into practice. But that's the cool thing about modern Stoicism. It's always encouraging you to put things into practice and to make it real in your life. The other thing I really like about it is that they're trying to gather evidence about how effective these things are. So I don't know if you looked into this when you're doing Stoic Week, but they started in 2012, as you said, and they've been studying people from like taking a measure, like a survey at the beginning, at the end, on all sorts of personality facets, like negative emotions and all these kind of sociological survey questions they have. In the first one, they saw a 10% reduction in negative emotions, which is pretty impressive. I mean, it's self-reported, and it's taking a measure at the beginning, at the end of the week, so they weren't sure if it would last. Like, it's one thing to say at the end of the week, I feel much better, but how will it last? So those are the type of things that they're looking into now. They keep running those surveys and tweaking the course handbook in relation to that. And they found that a week is good, but a month of the Stoic mindfulness and resilience training is better. And it lasts up to 3 months. The improvements last up to 3 months with almost no decrease in impact, which is pretty impressive. But and that's another cool thing. Like, I'm thinking, but it's self-reported and it's just the people who are coming to Stoicism. It's not like you've got a weird sample because it's people interested in Stoicism. But they admit all the limitations of their data, which I like. They're not pretending this is like, and that's why Stoicism is the cure for everything. Yeah, and they're really like, they're building up steam. I mean, I would love to see, and I'm sure they'd love to do, a big study controlling for personality types, with maybe like another group doing a different self-help intervention to compare to compare. Like maybe it'll be interesting to compare it to mindfulness or something, so we can see it against other disciplines.
Yeah, and you mentioned personality types, but like for me, that would be looking at maybe the 5-factor model and seeing, is it the highly neurotic people who get the most benefits? Do introverts get more benefits than extroverts? Like, you could really do some really interesting research on this, I think.
Yeah. I think the bigger this movement grows and the more popular it is, the more resources they'll have and the more they'll get funding and they'll be able to do all these things. So it's really exciting to see where that goes. And I would encourage anyone, especially if you heard Kat's description, because she makes it sound really fun. Well, I don't know if fun's the right word, but valuable.
Enjoyable.
To go and do Stoic Week, yeah, and take part in those surveys and contribute just by doing it, and maybe get some value out of yourself and contribute to finding out more data about how this works and if it works and how much it works, how well it works, all those sort of questions.
Yeah.
The other, I touched on it slightly before. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I wanted to ask you about the religious aspects and what your take is on that, but...
That's so funny because that's exactly what I was going to say. So I touched on that before. I don't know whether... So the question is, are the religious aspects to the original text, should we keep them in? Should we get rid of them? Are they putting people off? Are they actually essential to the whole, to the whole thing? Does it work without, can you take God out of this? Because I feel like some of the, like I was saying about the social responsibility and stuff, that can be explained and sort of squared away if you think of us all as part of a bigger whole, which is like, like they call it the
one
cosmopolis.
Creation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't really necessarily think that that's a coherent way to think about things, or I'm not sure. Like, so there was a guy, I read an article called "Why Modern Stoicism Misses the Point" by Mark Vernon. And he's, I presume, although I don't think he actually said this in the article, he's in the keep God in Stoicism camp. And he says Stoicism proper is about aligning your life to the logos. The logos means, it's kind of like, I don't even know how to describe it. And I'm sure if any Stoics are listening, they'll feel like I'm not represented this quite right. But logos is, obviously, it's related to logic. So it's how things function. But they have this sense around it of it's somehow divine. It's like the way things are. I don't know. Anyway, so he said Stoicism proper is about lining your life to the logos. The all-powerful God has its way anyway. Only the divine knows best. So give up your desire and desire what God determines. Then you will begin to perceive God in all things, in every tree, in every mountain, in other souls.
Yeah.
So, the Stoics were determinists. They thought that things were going to happen the way that they happen, and, that's it, basically. And I'm kind of in that camp too. I don't know if I call myself a determinist, but I certainly have my reservations about the existence of free will. So the question that Mark Vernon raises in this article is, can we, like, giving up your desires to God, that sounds nice. Giving up your desires to, like, brute indifferent nature? That's a bit harder, isn't it? It's a bit of a harder sell. Like, it's much easier to say, well, it is what it is, when what it is God's will. It's much harder to say, well, it is what it is, when what it is just what it is.
Random,
Yeah. And also I think...
Yeah, go on.
There was a guy, again, in the lightning talks, these were great little just snapshots of ideas that people in the Stoic community are having. He talked about Epicureanism, which is another philosophy that was around at the time. And we now think of it as like almost like hedonism, like because it's related to food, and like the way we talk about it today is like, if you're an Epicurean, you love your food and you love your sensory pleasures. But Epicureans are actually just more like they kind of have a lot in common with the Stoics. They basically were like, the important thing is to live a good life, and that didn't mean stuffing your face with lovely food. It meant eating food, but in moderation, so you didn't get a stomachache or didn't become unhealthy, and like all these things. So it's kind of like practical hedonism. So they believed in a materialistic universe. They didn't believe in God or in the divine, as far as I understand it. And they were basically talking about how pleasure is the highest good, and you need to live a life that maximizes it over the long term. So practically, their lives were very much like Stoics. They didn't bother themselves with things they couldn't control. They just tried to live a good life and find pleasure where they could. They also shunned politics, which is obviously not true of the Stoics. Stoics were quite political and thought that it was important to be engaged. So if we give up the metaphysics of Stoicism, aren't we just like collapsing back into Epicureanism? And then, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think Epicureanism sounds pretty good, but it's kind of weird to be like, no, we want to be Stoics, but we don't. But
we're going to strip away all of this stuff.
Yeah. I'm going to read more about Epicureanism and see if I can get involved more in that.
I think I might be one, but by default. But anyway, I think that is my problem with it. It's like, you don't just go, yes, science, you update. I get that. That's part of the deal with science. But I think there's something wrong about just going back to the history of things and just trying to ignore where these ideas originated. I think it's so tied in with it. It's just doing a disservice to those original thinkers by saying, it's just condescending. It's like, oh, you did a good job. You got most of it right. But your fundamental worldview was what we think is wrong. It's like, no, don't do that. Like, that feels disrespectful.
Yeah, I get it's difficult because I completely get what you mean. And I do think, like, I think we've said this before in other episodes, like that kind of pick and mix attitude towards spirituality or religion or whatever. It worries me because I think you're just going to pick the stuff that you like, and all the stuff that's too difficult for you to deal with, you leave behind, and then you might not get the benefits. But then again, what's a skeptic atheist to do? I can't start believing in God. So
no, and okay, so this is the thing, like, because when I hear about those ideas, I'm in a position where I'm like, I so badly want to believe. I want to believe all of that fully. I can kind of believe it, but I'm like, no, I really want to believe. That quote you read out from, what was his name? Mark Vernon?
Yeah.
I want to feel those words as, like, super duper true. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's somebody who's like, oh man, I wish I didn't even hear those words. I don't, the difficulty for all of us is just to try and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And like, hopefully that the God stuff doesn't put people off. They can just see it for what it is. It's like, oh yeah, in the context of the time, that's what people believed. And someone like me, I mean, it makes me like Stoicism more. And it's almost like maybe there is actually a really logical route for me into these deeper, more religious beliefs that I'm trying to access. So it's really interesting. It can kind of it can go both ways.
That's true. I didn't even think of it that way. Yeah, you could come into Stoicism as an atheist and be like, well, I actually quite like this idea of the divine cosmopolis and a sort of kind of, I don't know whether you'd call it pantheism, or because pantheism is like God is in everything, or you might call it pandeism, like everything is God. Subtly different, but kind of the same idea. And really, I don't know, is that really I'm not even sure I want to call that a religious belief. Is that just a perspective on reality? Because reality exists. So you can think of it as reality, or you could call it God. I mean, I don't know whether it's even just like almost like semantics, but obviously these words have weight in our consciousness, so...
Completely. And that's the other thing. It's kind of like the word God just messes with people. But I can easily conflate the scientific worldview with this kind of religious worldview. I can put it all together and be like, well, if everything's God, then, that science has got too. I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but again, they're not they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think it's not a bad idea to read these texts with that in the back of your mind. Like, how can you sit with those ideas? And it's difficult for people, because I think a lot of the time when we read these ideas, we want it to make sense in our existing worldview straight away. We don't want to do the hard work of trying to get it to, like, maybe even change our mind about something, or make us see the world in a different perspective. That's hard.
Yeah, that's actually what I really liked about that journaling lady, because she was like, she didn't say just throw away the bits you don't like. She was suggesting that you engage in a dialogue with them and really think carefully about why you liked it and why you didn't like it, and what word would you feel more comfortable with and why would you feel more comfortable with it. Like, doing that kind of deep work instead of just like doing like a search and replace for God in the manuscript, which is probably what I'd be tempted to do, to be honest. Yeah. I think it's something that it's definitely going to be something that Stoics are talking about and grappling with, because, as I said, that's one of the interesting things about the Stoic movement. There are people there who are definitely, believers, who are deists of some type, probably. And there are people there who are hardcore atheists, and yet we're all in this together trying to figure out how to live. And I think, that kind of makes me feel hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. So,
anyway, I think I would definitely suggest that people give it a go. Would you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, a really good way of getting a taste of it is Stoic Week, which I guess will be next year.
Yeah.
I personally really want to attend a conference after talking to you about that, because I really believe in conferences and meeting people like minds.
Yeah.
And I imagine that kind of association will be really powerful.
I would suggest if you can't do a Stoic Week, perhaps you should pick up Marcus Aurelius. And I was really put off by meditations because his name is old and boring. And the introduction to every edition of this is written by one of the chalky old uncle types of Stoics. So it's like, oh God, I have to read this. So skip the introduction, and I suggest skip book 1, because book 1 is the one that's like, oh, I'm thankful to my father for this, this, and this. It's just, I don't know, not into it. Start on book 2. Book 2 is where he just starts giving these like pithy, like 1 or 2 sentence aphorisms about stuff he's learnt. And then you can go back and read the intro and the book 1 afterwards. But I had this book on my shelf. In fact, my brother gave me a copy from Christmas like years and years ago when I was a teenager, and I never got past the introduction because I was like, oh God, chalky old uncle business. But yeah, then when I picked up for this episode, I was like, oh, I'm going to force myself to read this thing. And as soon as I got into book 2, I was hooked, and I was like, this is the best thing ever.
Nice.
It just feels really it feels like he's really talking to you. It doesn't feel like an old guy from the past. It feels like it's relevant to my life. And he doesn't talk about politics of his time or anything to do with his time. He just gives you advice on how to handle yourself. Yeah, amazing. Really, really good.
Same with Seneca's letters. I listened to the audio edition that Tim Ferriss made happen. And again, because they're letters to people, they're dealing with examples, like real world examples, which are still relevant and almost like comically relevant to today. And Massimo's How to Be a Stoic audiobook. For me, it's listening to these things was really helpful.
So what do you think, like, the most useful takeaway you got from this experience? What's the Stoic wisdom to take home?
Realizing that I'm part of this grand cycle of life and death, and that it is inherently good to not get lost in extreme emotions, and to treat each other and the world around us with care and respect, because it's all part of it. It's all part of it, man. That's like reading that back, I'm like, oh, well, that's stereotypical and obvious, but it's true. And like actually feeling that is really something.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, mine is much more basic. Mine is just the dichotomy of control. That idea of there are some things you can control and some things you can't. It's so simple, and it's something that like everyone should know, and it's so obvious. But the other day I was trying to get to sleep, and I was thinking through a conversation I'd had and thinking how I could have articulated myself better. And you know how you, like, when you're just running these conversations through and through again and again. And then what always happens to me is I'm like, well, I have to get up early tomorrow, and now I'm not going to be able to sleep. So you've got 2 worries going on in your head at the same time. You've got the worry about, did I say something wrong in this conversation, and the concern about not having enough rest, so you're not going to be able to be your best the next day. And I was just like, okay, I cannot control what I said in the past. That's insane to be worrying about. Let's put that one away. And practically, I can't control how much sleep I get. All I can control is like whether I'm breathing, like the thoughts that are running through my head. So I was just like, okay, fine, I'll just concentrate on, I have a couple of mantras that I use to try and get myself to bed, to get myself to rest, get myself to go to sleep. So I just concentrated on let go, breathe in, breathe out, think let go. And I wasn't using it as a tool to get to sleep or to forget about. I was just like, these are the things I can control right now.
This is all I can do.
Exactly. It's pitch black. I'm lying down in bed. There's nothing I can do about anything in the world apart from control my breath and control the thoughts. And I did. And I don't know. It gave me a peace that I find really hard to access at times like that.
Yeah.
And that was just basically thinking, wait a minute, what's in your control and what's not in your control? And so I'm going to really try and remind myself to do that at times of stress, because it's simple but invaluable.
I think a new tattoo is needed.
Oh no, don't tempt me. Yeah.
So Stoicism, I think we got 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, I'd say at least 2 thumbs up, maybe even 4.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know with a tweet or an email. We'd really love to hear about your experiences.
Yes, please tell us what we got wrong. You can email us at hello@seekerandskeptic.com and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @seekerskeptic.
You'll find the show notes for this and every episode at seekerandskeptic.com.
And if you're interested, you can find my skeptically themed comics at rebeccaonpaper.com or follow me on Twitter @RebeccaOnPaper.
And I'm at yoga_astrology on Twitter. And you can find me exploring the intersection of yoga and astrology at yogaandastrology.com.
If you liked what you heard and fancy supporting the show and spreading the word, we'd really appreciate a rating and review in the Apple Podcast Store or wherever you're listening.
Or just tell somebody you know about the show. Thanks for listening.